Hi, fourth graders. Welcome to the Middle Ages. This is Chapter 2. Before we get started, I have a few questions for you. The first one is, the Middle Ages refer to a time period that existed in Western Europe after the fall of what empire? Meaning after what empire was no longer in existence? And hopefully you remember that the Middle Ages comes after the Roman Empire that we studied in third grade. The Middle Ages refer to a 1,000-year period in history between what two other time periods? Well, the Middle Ages comes between ancient times and modern times is what we live in. During the Middle Ages, Charlemagne introduced the concept of feudalism. Remember, you heard about kings, nobles, including lords, freemen, and serfs. So how does feudalism work? Well, feudalism is when people higher up in society, such as kings and lords, offer protection to those lower in society, such as serfs and freemen. In exchange, the serfs and freemen swear their loyalty to the nobles and the king. And finally, what role did the church play in the Middle Ages? Well, it provided stability and hope during a very difficult time, and over time, it grew to be very rich and very powerful. We have listened to Chapter 1, which gave us an overview about the important time in history we call the Middle Ages. Today we are going to hear Chapter 2, titled To the Manor Born. And I'm going to come back to this title and we're going to connect it to the reading. So, today our purpose for reading is to find out about the lives of lords and serfs in the Middle Ages. And we're going to be able to answer the big question, how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? All right, here we go. To the manor born. If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life followed one of a few set paths. If you were the child of a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants, too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider or sew, to dance, and to play a musical instrument. Occasionally, too, girls learned to read. That means sometimes they did. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to be a king or a queen or a lord or a lady yourself. So let's quickly go review that. If you were a privileged child, meaning you grew up in a manor, you had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You had a relatively nice house. You might have had servants. You may have learned to read and write. Maybe you learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you became a skilled swordsman. If you were a girl, you learned to embroider, dance, and play a musical instrument. And maybe you learned to read. When you grew up, you became a king or a queen, or a lord or a lady. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farm workers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock, or animals the people feed, or animals that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freemen. Serfs were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. So, the author tells us that if you were a serf, your primary job was to grow food and tend to the livestock. Livestock are animals that fed the people. And you did that for your lord. So, taking a look at paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, was it the serfs or the privileged people that there were more of? Well, I can see from my reading that most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. So that means most people were serfs or freemen in the Middle Ages. serfs usually spent their entire lives living on a landowner's or lord's estate. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in his castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often the nearby villages too. The lord also controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. So you might have worked for a lord, but they didn't feed you. You still had to feed yourself and clothe yourself and take care of your own family. But you still had to work for them. So let's take a look at this. On this page, in this paragraph, there is another name for a castle. Where did they live? Well, we said that they lived in a castle or manor house. A manor house is another name for a castle. The author titled this chapter "To the Manor Born," which means if you were born into a manor, you were born privileged and lived in the manor house from the time you were born. You lived a privileged life from that moment on. Everyone's way of life was set from the time he or she was born. And if someone was born to the manor, he or she would live a privileged life. If you were born to a serf, you lived a serf's life. All right, bottom of the page. Serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the lord. When serfs wanted to marry, the lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up as the serfs for the same landlord. So, based on what I just read, who do you think had more power and freedom in the Middle Ages? Lords or serfs? Well, I would say lords had more power and more freedom. The serfs had to get permission from the lords to do many things, including traveling and getting married, but the lords didn't have to get permission. Lords also owned and controlled the land and often the nearby towns and villages. The serfs did not own or control any of their own land. So, the lords had the most power. However, we learned on the page before that there were more serfs and freemen than lords. So the smaller group of people had the most power. All right. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmland that was divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the lord. The rest of the time, they worked on the strips of land where their own crops were grown. Remember, they still had to grow their own food. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses in or near a village. Watch as I underline some things. Their houses were made from mud and wood. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made from rushes and straw. They usually only had one room. Serfs slept on straw beds. In each house there was a small fireplace for cooking, and smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof. What did this just describe? Well, hopefully you said, those are descriptions of the serf houses. So I close read and then I bracketed it and made a note. That's the serfs' houses. Next paragraph. The lord increased his wealth in many ways. Again, watch as I underline. The lord increased his wealth in many ways. That means he got more money in many different ways. In addition to working the farmland for the lord, serfs paid taxes to the lord in the form of money, crops, and livestock. And sometimes the lord ran a mill, and the serfs he even charged his serfs a fee to grind their grain into flour. So the lord was already wealthy, and to get more money and more crops, he would make the serfs pay taxes for staying on their land and on his land, and if he had a way to grind grain into flour, he made the serfs pay to do that, even though they were working there and doing it themselves. If the crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In times of hardship, the Lord did not always come to the aid of his serfs. Even when food supplies were low, serfs were not allowed to hunt in the Lord's forest. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This was called poaching, and the serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. So, based on what we just read right here, did the severe punishment stop serfs from hunting in the Lord's forest to avoid starving? The answer is no. And so what do we call the practice of illegally hunting in the Lord's forest? It's called poaching. So to avoid starving, people hunted illegally, and this is called poaching. Poaching still happens today, friends. Next paragraph. Some farm workers were freemen. Freemen were not under the same strict control of the Lord. For example, if a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in a town without being found, he could become a freeman too. The Middle Ages was a violent time. I'm going to do some underlining as I read here. Violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need for armed protection shaped medieval society. Usually, high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the kings, and lords swore their loyalty to higher-ranking nobles. Freemen and serf had to be loyal to their lord. In exchange for their loyalty, the Lord offered his protection, unless they were starving and then he didn't feed them. If the Lord needed to raise an army, needed to put an army together, he would require his freemen on his estates to serve as foot soldiers. Okay? So remember, the freemen were not under the same strict control of the Lord. However, if the Lord needed an army, they had to become foot soldiers. So, let's take a look at these images. We've got the images here at the bottom of this page, and we've got the image here at the bottom of this page. So if I look at it carefully, I can see that this is a Lord's manor or estate. And I'm going to do some circling. Let me get a color that we haven't used yet. How about that color? So I can tell that it's a manor or estate because right here is a large manor or castle that's well protected. It's got a wall around it, and then it's sitting up on a hill. And I can see that there's a church. So on this manor, there's a church. I can see that there's little serf houses. These are all houses that would have been the homes of the serfs. And I can see that out here in the field, there are strips. And by strips, we mean there's a field, there's a field, there's a field. It's like a piece of paper cut into strips, but it's actually land cut into strips. We can see those strips again over here. 1, 2, 3, 4 strips. I can also see that here is a serf plowing the Lord's field. I can see serfs over here tending to some sheep. I can see that this is a mill with a water wheel for power. And I can see that there's some more serf houses. Okay, so what was like if you were a boy serf? From an early age, you work a full day. You wake up just before sunrise and go to sleep when it's dark. For breakfast, you have rye bread and water, or perhaps a watery ale. Even before the sun is fully risen, and regardless of the weather, you begin your work on the land. So I'm going to close read that, and I just noticed that that is all about a serf's day, a boy serf's day. Now I see it says in the springtime. So in springtime, you are busy plowing and planting seeds, and you may assist with the delivery of the baby calves and lambs. At midday, you walk home for a simple meal of rye bread and maybe a small piece of cheese. After lunch, you return to work, cutting logs for the Lord's fire. In the summertime, summer months, you tend to the crops you planted in the spring, and you keep the hungry birds and insects away from the crops. In the autumn or the fall, it's time to harvest, and it is perhaps the busiest time of all. You help your mother and sisters pick fruits and berries that they preserve and store for the winter. Using a simple tool called a scythe, you harvest the grain crops such as wheat, rye, oats, and barley. You help store the grain. A good harvest makes everyone, especially the Lord, very happy. It means there is food to eat during the winter months. A good harvest is a time for celebration for all. Nevertheless, you have to get used to having less food to eat in the winter time. Less food to eat in the winter time. And you have to get used to the feeling of being hungry and cold more often than not. Sometimes your parents find it difficult to make ends meet. That means they find it difficult to put food on the table and keep their family warm. Even if ice and snow lay upon the frozen earth, you still have jobs to do. You have to feed and care for the livestock. You have to repair fences and barns. All the while, you continue to work the strips of land for your family. Each evening as the sun is setting, you return home quite exhausted. You end your day with a meal called pottage that your mother and sisters have prepared. Pottage is a vegetable stew with a grain and a tiny piece of meat or fish in it. After a good night's sleep, you'll wake up and do it all again. All right, medieval musings. In the Middle Ages, a kind of food made from grain was used as a plate. What is it? It is bread. And they used to eat their plate, which means they had to eat the bread. The plate was part of their meal. Number 2, in the Middle Ages, people kept coins in clay pots. The pots were made from a type of clay called pig. Today, many children place coins in a special container, the name of which originates in the Middle Ages. What do we call this container? Well, here's a hint. Pig. We call it a piggy bank. So if you have a piggy bank, the name of that came from the Middle Ages. A popular board game that is still played today arrived in Europe from Persia in the 800s. What is the name of the game? Clue. Make sure you check your answer, or you can look at this board right here. Checkers is the name of the game that came from the Middle Ages. Okay? And finally, stained glass windows adorned medieval churches. Most people in the Middle Ages could not read or write. Stained glass windows depicted stories from the Bible and helped to communicate Christian beliefs. Look closely at this stained glass window. A letter of the alphabet has been hidden for you to find. When you find it, record this letter on activity page 2.3. After you find all the letters in the letter quest activities, you will rearrange them to spell a word related to the Middle Ages. Now, you have to look carefully. The letter is right here, right there in that circle. It is the letter I. So if you have time, go find activity workbook page 2.3 and put I next to chapter 2. Thanks, friends. Have a great day.